I'm here with Scott Wallace, who is the co-chair of the Wallace Global Fund. And I wanted to talk to you about the work that you're doing at the fund, and particularly the crisis that we have with regard to climate change. We're talking the day after the first Democratic presidential debate. And I was wondering, first of all, did you hear that debate?
Yes, absolutely.
And did you get a sense from that debate that Democratic politicians grasp the urgency that you feel about the climate change crisis?
I think it's a stunning turnaround how in the last presidential election, climate never crossed anybody's lips. This time, all the Democrats are talking about it. It is one of the top issues. Even the Republicans are talking about it in their debates. I think the political salience of climate has just taken off like crazy. And that's because you've got this movement. You've got Paris coming up, the huge global climate negotiations in the UN coming up in December. But then you've got all these kids and this whole divest movement all over the country that it's just excited the base, excited the grassroots. And it's inevitable that politicians will notice this, and it gets onto their radar. They get questions at the town hall meetings when they're doing their visits to Iowa and New Hampshire and everywhere else. So, yeah, it's really wonderful to see how the politicians are making this one of their highest priorities and trying to outdo each other with great plans for renewables and strong stance in the negotiations, the international commitments that are being made. So,
so there is a sense that the grassroots work is having a significant impact.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the really fun part about it is and something we've been involved in is the students on the college campuses.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this started out as a very targeted thing to get college endowments to divest from coal,
Mm-hmm.
because coal is the dirtiest. And then the students and 350.org, Bill McKibben's group, said, oh, wait a minute, we all agreed, if you just do coal, then they'll say, okay, we'll get out of coal and we'll just do more fracking and more other dirty fossil fuels. So it became all about fossil fuels, something that is consistent and consistent with the whole climate movement. Get out of burning dirty fossils that come out of the ground. So that has been a lot of fun to see the kids catch fire with this.
And a lot of people, a lot of grown-ups, look at a Bill McKibben and say, this man is an absolute lunatic.
I don't know if you remember, but in college we kind of liked lunatics.
Yeah.
He's got huge passion.
Yeah, but what does that say about how movements move the needle?
Well, what it says is that it takes a movement. You know, a lot of us foundations who have been doing climate for a long time, it's not enough to fund the study or the scholarship or a high-level conference or to fly people off to the next UN climate negotiation. The needle gets moved when there is a movement. Mm-hmm. And in this case, it's not just in the US. It's all over the world, the divest movement. We were really thrilled when Desmond Tutu was a friend of ours from South Africa. He was so into environmental issues, and then he made the connection between the divestment campaign over apartheid. He said, okay, if there's something immoral going on, we have to stop investing in it. So he did a video announcement for us at our press conference last September, just before the People's Climate March,
Mm-hmm.
And calling for divestment from fossil fuels and invest in clean energy solutions. And he directly compared it to the South African divestment campaign. And there are two things about that. That took a long time, and it was successful. It took 10 years from the start of the divestment campaign on apartheid. And you had universities like Harvard say, oh, no, we're not going to use our endowment, the largest university endowment in the country,
Mm-hmm.
for social purposes. We're just in this to make money. Well, 10 years later, they caved because the students were on them. and they wore them down, and finally Harvard divested. And within a year, the apartheid regime in South Africa collapsed. Desmond Tutu feels a huge debt of gratitude to the global divestment community and to the pressure that that generated to collapse a corrupt system of government. And what's a little bit different this time, which I think has lent even more moral force to it, is that it's not just get out of the immoral stuff. We've added this component of you must convert your money to better purposes, to purposes that are consistent with fighting climate change. So invest in clean energy, in solar, in Teslas, and in renewable energy. And
so is there a specific victory that you've had in the last couple of years on that front?
Well, I would say we just did another press conference in New York on the anniversary of the last one. That was exciting because at the first press conference last year, we had rounded up $50 billion in assets, 50 foundations, $50 billion in assets, committing to divest from bad stuff and invest in good, clean energy solutions. And we promised, we really stuck our neck out to say, we think we can triple that by this time next year. And we really, oh, geez, can we do this? Well, last 2 weeks ago, we had our press conference. Leo DiCaprio and his foundation came, and they joined us in making the commitment. What we did was multiply 50-fold the $50 billion. There's now $2.6 trillion of assets under management in America, in universities, in foundations, in faith-based institutions, and now surprisingly, it has spread to non-values-based investors. You know, university and a foundation, you got a mission to be socially responsible and so on. But now it's spreading to pension funds and the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. CalPERS and CalSTRS, the largest pension funds in America and California, they're doing this. Mm-hmm. And I guess the huge development that has made that happen is that our approach was twofold, not just to make the moral argument, which was the apartheid argument, but to make the financial argument that if you're invested in fossil fuels, you're going to lose money. That's where the risk is, because there is liability attached. Think of the Deepwater Horizon explosion in the Gulf. And then there's this whole problem of stranded assets. You know, the science is that you cannot burn all the fossil fuel reserves that we currently have in the ground. So when ExxonMobil has on their balance sheet $3 trillion of oil in the ground, and they list that as an asset, and that jacks up their capital valuation on the stock market, the realization now, and the financial analysts are having a drumbeat confirming this, that stuff must stay in the ground. Therefore, it must come off the books. Therefore, the value of that stock drops. And coal, you're seeing, is just falling through the floor. But increasingly, the non-values-based investors are saying, hold on, even without the moral aspect of this, we have to get out of fossil fuels because there's too much risk involved there.
Yeah. I'm curious, though, about when you talk about that amount of money now going into renewable energy, how does that translate to homeowners, everyday, ordinary people in the street?
Well, as to how they can make this happen?
In terms of how this affects the availability, the affordability, the jobs that you can get from...
Right. Well, hopefully, I mean, there are two aspects to how it affects ordinary people. One is if you have a pension, a 401k, any sort of personal retirement account, you can go and tell your investment advisor, go buy me one of these fossil fuel free funds, one of these clean energy funds. I don't want to be a part of the problem, I want to be a part of the solution, and you'll make good money too. You'll be better for your retirement. But the other part is with the flow of trillions of dollars of investment, private investment money into renewable energy, you're going to see a massive expansion of the growth of the energy, the solar and wind and biomass energy sectors, and that's where the jobs are. You know, rooftop installation of solar And building wind farms, which are manufactured in the American Midwest out of American steel, that's American jobs, as opposed to buying our oil from the Middle East, from unstable regimes there that are spreading unrest. So it's definitely a win for workers in America to grow the domestic renewable energy industry.
One thing about the politics of this, when you talk about renewable energy, one of the things that has concerned a lot of people is the power of the fossil fuel industry, shown as an example through initiatives that are not ballot initiatives, but legislative initiatives to make it harder for people to adopt solar and wind power. We're having that fight here in the District of Columbia with people concerned about the merger of Exelon and Pepco and whether that's going to throttle the ability of the District of Columbia to move toward clean energy as opposed to dirty energy.
Well, it's definitely that's a tough obstacle, the power of the fossil fuel industry. But it's starting to come down. I mean, you talked about the debates. The politicians are now feeling that there is some political payoff in disrespecting the fossil fuel industry and in saying that we must get off the fossil fuel faucet. But they still have enormous political power. They spread it around very generously. And if you watch the Sunday morning talk shows, there's just massive pro-fossil fuel advertising that's targeted at the policymakers in America. That's a long-term prospect. There's still huge fossil fuel subsidies federally, and you'd think that would be the easiest thing. Okay, we might be all of the above in terms of our energy mix, but why do you give preferential subsidies to the worst player, to the dirtiest form of fossil fuel?
And fight against the subsidies for the cleanest.
Right. Either treat everybody equally, because renewable energy is of more domestic benefit, economic benefit, and jobs benefit. Either give them all the same subsidy or give them all no subsidy and let the better source win. Mm-hmm. So, but the fact that those subsidies and all the many forms of tax and policy incentives that the fossil fuel industry gets, that's going to be a tough one to roll those back. But hopefully, in the wake of Paris, there will be some real momentum. Maybe it'll take the next presidential election to show that the U.S. has the sustained progressive leadership to continue leading the world on this. You got to worry that if the White House reverts to the more regressive policymakers, then it might be a signal that we're going to leap back into all of the above. We love fossil fuels sector, and progress will be slowed, and international momentum could dry up.
Right. What beyond Paris, and what are your next fights? What are your next goals on this issue? What is the fund looking to do going forward?
Well, I guess getting the strongest possible international agreement is huge. It won't end in Paris, right. But you see all the major economies, the 7 major economies now have all made announcements of more ambitious targets. I think they will have to be ratcheted up. I think what we're focused on to try to do that is grassroots movement building, which is what our foundation does. That's because my grandfather was the champion of the common man. I don't know if you're familiar with his most famous speech when he was Vice President of the United States was the Century of the Common Man speech. Henry Luce, the publisher of Time magazine, was saying that the century that comes after World War II must be the American century. Mm-hmm. America will rule the world, right, with Britain by its side. And Henry Wallace said, no, that's ridiculous. America has no more right to rule the world than the Nazis do. It's the sitting vice president of America. And we must have the century of the common man everywhere in the world. And so, and then he ran for president in 1948 when he thought that Truman was going to get us into nuclear Armageddon with the Cold War. So that's what we try to carry on here, his tradition of strengthening the ability of the common man to stand up together, unify for whatever it is that they need. We're active in several countries. So the movement takes different form in different countries. Today in America, the movement that engages and energizes young people the most is climate. Because my generation is screwing it up. We don't seem to care. They're the ones that are going to have to live with it. And Miami and southern lower Manhattan are going to be underwater.
Yeah.
We'll be dead. They got to live with it.
They got to live with it. I wonder what your grandfather would think if he were alive today and just looked at the political landscape that we have right now. We've got this Bernie Sanders presidential candidacy that's caught fire that looks a lot like the spirit of Henry Wallace. But you've also have this other stuff going on. And I'm just sort of, what do you think his take would be?
Well, I think Bernie Sanders is kind of channeling Henry A. Wallace. I mean, he is just a fervent populist. He's all about the common man, the working guy, and income inequality. I think the other part that my grandfather might worry about is he was destroyed late in his political career by when Truman saw him coming in as a third party to the left. He had this machine that had to rip Henry Wallace apart as a commie. And so by slapping that label on him, oh my God, a communist, his support went from 10% in the polls down to less than 1% by election day. That program of accusing Wallace of being like un-American was very successful. And I think my grandfather would probably look at Bernie and say, oh my God, please don't call yourself a socialist. You're not a socialist.
But when we both saw that CNN debate last night, it was one of the first things out of the gate was whether he was somehow an anti-capitalist.
Yeah, well, he said it on Meet the Press the day before. He said, "Yeah, I'm not a capitalist. I'm a democratic socialist." Well, labels matter. There was a poll recently saying that the category of person that Americans are least likely to endorse for president, and they listed like Muslim, atheist, Catholic. At the rock bottom was socialist. So if you want to check the polls to see what Americans find most toxic, socialist is the most toxic word. So, and he's not a socialist. He grew up in a capitalist country. He believes in a regulated capitalist system.
Right. And if you also look at the polls, capitalists, at least the ones at the top, don't have a great image either.
Right. Oh, absolutely. But if you took Bernie's tax plan and increased the taxes to, what did he say, 45%? I mean, that's still far lower than it was under Reagan in his early years. It's way lower than it was under Eisenhower and previous Republicans. That's a pretty light burden on the upper 1%. That is not socialist. That is regulated capitalism. It's progressive populist capitalism. So I think my grandfather would probably say to Bernie, ixnay on the socialism side.
But he would be very happy, I would think, with the idea of building the sort of grassroots movement that is a counterpoint to the big money politics that we're seeing.
Absolutely.
Right now.
My grandfather funded his 1948 campaign. We're talking the entire progressive political party. The funding stream was charging people who came to hear his speeches 25 cents. So the typical donor to the Progressive Party in 1948 gave 25 cents, and they had millions of dollars raised from that. And then selling flyers or neckties, pennants. People would pay a little money for this and that, and that's what Bernie's doing. The small donor That's a great way to build a movement and keep the fat cats out. You don't need them.
Right.
And
no, we just need the confidence then to just build forward, build on that energy.
Yeah, and make it a big grassroots movement, a big tent that has tons of ordinary people volunteering, chipping in a little money here and there. But I'm just Bernie has a tough hill to climb here, just because of the way he's framed his candidacy and the biases in the American body politic.
But those are biases that I would hope, with the help of guys like you, that we would be able to overcome.
Well, it's all about the people's movements. Just get them mobilized, get them banging down the walls of Jericho and demanding stuff, and that's where the power is in this country, and in every country.
Thank you very much.
You are most welcome. Pleasure
All right.
talking.
Great.